She wiped the armrest after his hand touched it, twice. Then, as if scrubbing wasn't enough, she sprayed perfume directly in his face and whispered loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I didn't pay for first class to sit next to a janitor." Heads turned. No one said a word. Not when she called the attendant. Not when she accused him of smelling like bleach. Not even when she dropped his personal notebook on the floor and stepped on it with her Louis Vuitton heel. All because he was black. All because of the uniform on his chest. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, is who he really was. And when the truth landed, it hit harder than any turbulence ever could. This isn't just another flight horror story. This is the moment years of quiet injustice collided with one seat, one uniform, and one man who refused to break. Think this could never happen today? Think again. Tell us, where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you were sitting in 2C? If you believe in stories that expose the truth and flip the script, hit like, subscribe, and stay right here. Because this isn't just a twist. It's a reckoning. Marcus Hill boarded the plane with the quiet stride of a man used to being overlooked. The first-class cabin gleamed, chrome finishes, wide leather seats, and chilled champagne already resting in crystal glasses on the tray tables. His Navy janitor uniform, neatly pressed and adorned with a facility badge, stood in stark contrast to the sea of tailored suits and glittering jewelry. Yet he walked with calm assurance, not because of how he looked, but because of who he was inside. His seat, 2A, was right by the window, as requested. As he adjusted his carry-on and prepared to sit, a woman in a pristine white blazer slid in beside him. Seat 2B. Karen Middleton, in her late 40s, with coiffed blonde hair and expensive sunglasses still perched atop her head, looked up from her phone. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, then lingered with distaste. Without a word, she nudged her designer roller bag sharply to the side, the hard shell knocking against Marcus's knee just as he lowered himself into the seat. He winced, not from pain, but from the pointed message, "You're in my space." "Apologies," he offered quietly, though it was clear he had done nothing wrong. Karen didn't respond. Instead, she pulled a monogrammed handkerchief from her handbag and wiped the armrest that Marcus had just brushed with his elbow. She then reached for a packet of sanitizing wipes, tore it open dramatically, and began scrubbing the seat controls, the tray table, and finally the armrest between them, where her elbow now sat, a clear territorial claim. Marcus watched from the corner of his eye, unmoved. This wasn't new, not by a long shot, but it still stung. Karen folded the used wipe into a square and, without hesitation, dropped it carelessly near Marcus's foot. It brushed against his shoe before resting like a dirty flag of protest. He didn't react. The engines hadn't even started, and the message was clear. "You don't belong here." As passengers continued to file in, Karen subtly shifted in her seat, turning her body away from Marcus, her shoulder angled toward the aisle, her entire posture reading, "This isn't what I paid for." She took out a small bottle of eucalyptus spray and spritzed it into the air around her, coughing lightly for effect. Marcus glanced toward the window, jaw clenched. No words had been exchanged beyond his soft apology, but the message had been delivered repeatedly and efficiently. Karen pressed the button for the flight attendant. A young man named Evan approached, smiling. "Yes, ma'am. Could I get a seat cover, please?" she asked with sugary precision. "This area feels used." Evan blinked. "Everything's been sanitized, ma'am." Karen leaned in slightly. "Still, for peace of mind." He nodded uneasy and moved off. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He'd known this might happen the moment he decided to keep the janitor uniform on. It was his choice, his test, and so far it was going exactly as expected. When Evan returned with his seat cover, Karen made a show of draping it across her leather seat, smoothing it with her palm as if laying down linens in a hospital room. "There," she murmured, "clean again." A woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The tension was thick but unspoken, no shouting, no insults, just precision-guided humiliation. Karen reached into her designer purse again and took out a small sachet of lavender-scented powder. She shook a tiny amount onto her lap, then gave Marcus a fleeting side glance, as though daring him to speak. He didn't. She reached for another wipe, this time cleaning her phone, then her hands, and finally the shared armrest one more time, even though Marcus had yet to touch it again. The second wipe, once used, was dropped again, this time landing partially on Marcus's foot. Karen didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply settled back into her seat, turned on her reading light, and began flipping through a fashion magazine, satisfied. Marcus leaned forward, picked up the wipe carefully, and tucked it into the seatback pocket beside him. His movements were calm, deliberate, but inside he felt the burn, the slow simmer of knowing someone believed your presence alone was contamination. He adjusted his posture, pulled out a small notebook, and quietly began to write. Across the aisle, a businessman glanced over. Their eyes met briefly. The man looked away, embarrassed, but not at Marcus. At the woman beside him. The flight crew prepared for departure. The seatbelt sign chimed. And still, not a single word from Karen. No curse. No slur. But her silence screamed louder than any insult. And Marcus heard every syllable. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside, dusk fell over the runway. The plane inched toward takeoff. Beside him, Karen reached again into her bag, pulling out a silk scarf. She wrapped it loosely around her nose and mouth, glancing sideways without turning her head. Then she leaned slightly toward the aisle and muttered into her glass of water, "It's going to be a long flight." Karen reached down and retrieved her MacBook from her designer tote. She opened it with practiced flair, the screen's glow immediately reflecting off her pale foundation, casting her face in a sterile blue light. But before beginning to type, she reached into the tote again and pulled out a large leather handbag, which she positioned upright between their seats. Like a border wall, it stood tall and deliberate on the shared armrest, her intent unmistakable. Divide, separate, isolate. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't shift. But his eyes flicked briefly to the bag, then to the edge of his seat, recalculating the invisible line she had just drawn across his space. Karen scooted an extra inch away, shifting her leg so that her knees angled as far from his as possible, then adjusted her scarf higher over her face, pinching it near the bridge of her nose with practiced indignation. Moments later, Marcus cleared his throat softly, more from the dry, recycled cabin air than any illness. The sound barely rose above a whisper, but to Karen, it may as well have been a fire alarm. She paused mid-keystroke, stiffened, and turned sharply to look at him, as if he had just coughed blood onto her lap. Her gaze narrowed, eyes scanning his uniform, his face, his hands, judging him not just with suspicion, but disgust. She stood up, not abruptly, but intentionally, like a protest staged in motion. She didn't say a word. Instead, she opened the overhead bin, retrieved a sealed package, and pulled out a new N95 mask. With deliberate care, she unwrapped it, tossed the wrapper onto Marcus's tray table without apology, and replaced her silk scarf with the sterile mask, tugging it hard into place with a small, exaggerated gasp. Then, with a quick spritz of sanitizer into her hands, she sat back down, adjusted her laptop screen, and resumed typing, her breaths now louder through the filtered mesh. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed out the window, but his jaw ticked. It wasn't about the mask, the laptop, the bag, or even the cough. It was about how easily she could perform this theater of rejection without anyone intervening. Across the aisle, a young couple glanced at him, then quickly away, their eyes filled with the kind of uncomfortable awareness people get when they witness something wrong but feel too powerless or complicit to act. Karen leaned slightly toward the aisle, putting her shoulder just enough out that her presence barely stayed within the limits of her seat. It was her way of retreating without surrendering, removing herself from proximity without giving up her privileged placement. Her body language screamed, "I will not share this space with someone like him." Every few minutes, she reached into her bag again, pulling out another wipe, another small bottle of sanitizer, another scented tissue. With each use, she avoided touching the armrest and instead dabbed along its edge, like she was disinfecting contaminated ground. Her laptop remained open, but her fingers now barely moved. She wasn't working. She was posturing. Marcus could feel it, the unspoken monologue that played behind her mask with every tiny motion. This isn't racism. It's hygiene. It's preference. It's self-care. But he knew better. He'd seen it wrapped in too many justifications before. Karen reached up to the service button and pressed it. A moment later, Evan returned, his polite smile looking a little more strained this time. "Yes, ma'am." Karen didn't look at Marcus. "I'd like a hot towel, please. And a change of glassware. This one's been too close." Evan hesitated, glanced briefly toward Marcus, then nodded and turned away. As he walked off, Karen reached into the seat pocket, pulled out the airline's magazine, and laid it across the shared tray table, spine facing Marcus, as another makeshift partition. The message kept evolving, from subtle distancing to full environmental manipulation. A wall of objects now stood between her and Marcus. Laptop, handbag, scarf, magazine, sanitized towel. Not a single word exchanged, yet an entire declaration made. Evan, now clearly aware of the tension in row 2, reached their seats with a practiced smile and offered Karen her pre-packaged blanket and a neatly folded kit containing eye shades, socks, lotion, and an embossed toiletry pouch. She accepted it with an icy nod, but the moment she unwrapped the blanket and unfolded it across her lap, she paused, sniffed the fabric dramatically, and wrinkled her nose. "Excuse me," she said, turning toward Evan with a voice just loud enough to draw attention from the surrounding rows. "I think this blanket's been soiled." Evan blinked. "Ma'am." Karen pulled the fabric closer to her nose, then held it up and gestured in Marcus's direction. "The man next to me. He was adjusting something before you handed this over, and I believe it may have brushed against something unsanitary." Her voice was cool but precise, every syllable coated in passive-aggressive concern. "There's a smell. Can you replace all of this? And sanitize the area?" Evan glanced between the blanket and Marcus, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded. "Of course, ma'am." Karen folded the blanket carefully and handed it over with her gloved fingers, as if returning contaminated evidence. As Evan disappeared toward the galley, Karen took out her lavender sachet again and gave it a firm squeeze between her palms, releasing a fresh floral cloud that she wafted toward her own face like a shield. Marcus remained still, hands folded over his notebook, his expression unreadable, though his eyes were sharp and alert. He was being framed delicately, strategically, as unclean, unfit, and undeserving of his seat. The scene was unfolding in slow motion, like a rehearsed play with invisible cues and deliberate staging. Karen leaned back and muttered, "Some things just shouldn't be shared," her voice low, but designed to be overheard. Marcus didn't take the bait. He inhaled once, exhaled slow, and continued observing. Minutes later, Evan returned with a fresh blanket, new amenities, and a bottle of fabric sanitizer, which he began spritzing lightly on Karen's armrest, apologizing again for the inconvenience. "It's not your fault," she whispered to him with a sweet smile. "You're just trying to do your job." She looked sideways at Marcus, then turned away as if it hurt her to make eye contact. The moment was meant to signal superiority, not just of class, but of conduct, as if she were the noble sufferer tolerating the presence of someone beneath her station. The next round of power play came with the meal service. A cart rolled down the aisle, polished silver trays stacked in warmers, accompanied by the soft clinking of porcelain and the faint aroma of seared steak, garlic butter, and wine sauce. Evan returned, offering both menus and explaining the available entrees. Marcus began to review the options quietly, flipping open the crisp leather-bound card. But before he could speak, Karen leaned forward and interrupted. "Oh, he doesn't need the full selection," she said cheerfully to Evan. "Just bring him the vegetarian tray, no seasoning. I know they keep a few simple options for sensitive diets." Evan looked confused. I believe he can choose for himself," he offered. Karen waved him off. "Of course he can, but I've seen this happen. My friend had a worker once who got sick just smelling the fish dish." She turned toward Marcus with a sweet, poisonous smile. "I'm sure you understand." Before Marcus could respond, she added, "Besides, it's better safe than sorry, isn't it?" Her words were coated in concern, but her tone carried the sharpness of insult. Marcus opened his mouth slightly, then closed it, offering only a long, quiet stare. It was a stare that said he saw everything: the manipulation, the erasure, the way she was rewriting the narrative with each small act of sabotage. Evan, caught in the crossfire of politeness and prejudice, hesitated again. "Mr. Hill, do you have a preference?" "I'll take the filet," Marcus replied evenly, never breaking eye contact with Karen. "Medium rare." She blinked, lips tightening, but said nothing. Evan took the order with relief and moved on. As Marcus settled back into a seat, Karen began to unwrap her silverware from its cloth bundle with sharp, irritated movements. She wiped each utensil individually, then leaned over and tapped the edge of her tray with her nail, as if checking for residue. When the meals arrived, she glanced at Marcus's steak with a look of theatrical concern. "Let me know if it's too much," she offered, still smiling. "I hear red meat can be heavy on the stomach if you're not used to it." As Evan moved on to the next row, Karen turned slightly in her seat, her profile just visible in Marcus's peripheral vision. She wasn't watching him anymore. She was preparing to weaponize him. She leaned subtly toward the passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged man with a sleek laptop and gold cufflinks who had barely looked up since boarding. Her voice lowered, confidential and practiced, the way someone might gossip about an affair at a charity gala. "I just think it's a little odd," she murmured, glancing briefly at Marcus before looking away. "The airline letting someone like that sit here in uniform. It makes me uneasy." The man looked up, confused. "Someone like what?" Karen gave a small, performative smile and raised her eyebrows. "The uniform. He's clearly a janitor or building staff. That's a maintenance badge. What if he's not even supposed to be here?" She didn't wait for a reply before leaning back into her seat, content to let the implication hang. The man didn't respond, but the seed had been planted. Moments later, she leaned to the other side, toward a woman scrolling on her phone, and repeated the same routine, this time with an added line. "I heard someone say he's here by mistake, that his seat got upgraded accidentally. He's been acting a little suspicious, too. Fidgeting, writing things down constantly." She whispered it just loud enough for the words to carry past her intended audience. Marcus heard. He didn't look over, didn't react, but he heard every word. His fingers, resting on the notebook in his lap, curled slightly at the edges. It wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was escalation. Karen was building a case against him, quietly, socially, strategically. A campaign of unease. And it was working. The couple 2 rows ahead began glancing back more frequently. One woman subtly pulled her purse from the floor and placed it on her lap. The man beside her adjusted his seat belt and avoided Marcus's gaze entirely. Karen saw it all and smiled to herself. She wasn't just isolating Marcus. She was colonizing the space around him, enlisting allies in her quiet crusade of exclusion. Not long after, a new flight attendant approached, not Evan, but a younger man with a name tag that read Tanner. He had the look of someone fresh on the job, his crisp uniform still stiff from dry cleaning, his posture overly formal. He stopped beside Marcus's seat with a forced smile. "Sir," he began, voice low but firm, "we've received a couple of concerns from nearby passengers. I'm going to stand here for a few minutes just to observe. It's protocol in situations like this." Marcus turned to face him slowly, his expression neutral. "Observe what exactly?" Tanner hesitated. "Just general cabin conduct. We want to make sure everyone feels safe." The word hung in the air like smoke. Safe. Marcus let it settle. He looked Tanner directly in the eye. "I haven't moved. I haven't spoken. I haven't so much as adjusted the lighting. What about my presence makes people feel unsafe?" Tanner flushed, but didn't answer. He stood straighter, eyes flicking down the aisle like he needed backup. Karen remained motionless beside them, her hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on the in-flight movie, pretending not to hear, pretending not to be the reason. Tanner remained beside Marcus's seat for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't speak again. He just stood there, tall and awkward, like a guard posted outside a courtroom. The message was clear. Marcus was being watched. Not for anything he'd done, but for what others had decided he might do, for the uniform he wore, for the quiet in his manner, for daring to belong. Passengers across the cabin continued to sneak glances. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. A few, Marcus noticed, looked quietly ashamed. But no one said anything. No one challenged it. Karen didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to scream or insult. All she had to do was hint, nudge, suggest. The fear would do the rest. Marcus adjusted in his seat, slowly. He wasn't moving out of unease, he was reclaiming space. His notebook opened again. He began to write, not words this time, but symbols, boxes, arrows, timelines. He was taking stock. The flight had hours to go, but the narrative was well underway. He wasn't the problem here, but the story being told was trying to make him one. Tanner had stepped away, the murmurs from nearby passengers had quieted, and for a fleeting moment, everything in row 2 felt still. But Karen wasn't done. She had built her theater of rejection piece by piece, and now she was ready to move from implication to interference. With the slow, deliberate movements of someone trying not to draw attention but desperately wanting to be noticed, she reached down toward the narrow storage compartment between the seats, where Marcus had quietly tucked away his personal items, a small black notebook, a lint roller, and an industrial-grade dusting tool, slim and packed in clear plastic. She flicked the flap open with the tip of her manicured fingers, pinched the handle of the dusting tool with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, and pulled it out, raising her eyebrows in mock surprise. "Oh," she said, feigning discovery, "I thought that was trash." Without waiting for a reply, she twisted her body slightly toward the aisle and dropped the tool into the footwell between 2 empty seats across the aisle, letting it land with a dull thud against the carpet. Then she brushed her hands together like dusting off dirt and returned to her seat, lips curled in smug satisfaction. Marcus turned his head toward her slowly, saying nothing, his eyes steady. His tool wasn't just for cleaning, it was his own, marked with his initials, a tool he had once used during inspections when he still worked the floors of the buildings he now oversaw. That object was history, pride, and she'd just thrown it away like debris. Karen, now emboldened by her latest act, reached for her beverage, a chilled glass of orange juice resting on her tray. She picked up, swirled the contents gently as if testing its texture, then let out a small, audible sigh. "Too much pulp," she muttered to herself. Then, as Marcus pulled his notebook from his jacket pocket to record something, his hand calm, movements precise, Karen shifted in her seat and accidentally nudged her tray. The glass tipped forward, a slow, choreographed topple, and the juice sloshed over the edge, spilling in a sticky arc that splattered across the open pages of Marcus's notebook. The pages soaked instantly, ink smudging into shapeless pools, and the scent of citrus filled the air. Karen gasped theatrically and covered her mouth. "Oh no, how clumsy of me." Her voice dripped with insincerity. She reached for a napkin but made no effort to blot the spill. Instead, she handed it to him like she was offering a peace treaty, an empty, useless gesture. Marcus stared at the pages, then looked at her, not in anger, not in rage, but in something colder. Calculation. He didn't move for a moment, didn't flinch, just watched her with the kind of silence that makes guilt echo. Karen, undeterred, leaned slightly closer. "You really should be more careful where you put those things. This paper, not great quality, probably absorbs everything, huh?" Her smile was faint, polished, and venomous. "I guess they don't give you better stock for cleaning logs." Across the aisle, a flight attendant noticed the spill and stepped forward. "Is everything all right here?" Karen raised her hand before Marcus could speak. "Just a small accident. I spilled my juice, but it's all under control." The attendant hesitated, glancing at Marcus's ruined notebook, then at Karen, but said nothing and stepped away. Marcus reached into his carry-on and withdrew a second notebook, identical in size but pristine. He placed it on the tray, flipped to a blank page, and resumed writing. The juice still dripped from the first one, slowly seeping into the fabric of his trousers. Karen watched him continue, visibly annoyed that her sabotage had failed to provoke. "Persistent," she muttered, then leaned back in her seat with a scoff. You janitors really know how to adapt, don't you? Marcus's grip on the pen tightened for half a second, but he kept writing. He logged everything, not just her actions, but her words, her patterns, her methods. Every insult dressed as an accident. Every invasion wrapped in false concern. He wasn't keeping score. He was building a record. The juice began to dry, the scent fading slowly. Karen turned toward the window, satisfied for now. As the steward returned to distribute hot towels and refreshment options, Karen sat up straighter, smoothing the creases in her trousers with delicate flicks of her wrist. Her composure had only sharpened after the juice spill, as if every successful violation of Marcus's space gave her more oxygen to breathe. Her attention drifted back toward Marcus's chest, the janitor badge stitched cleanly into the upper corner of his uniform shirt, the words Facility Operations Senior Level, embroidered in dark blue above the airline's logo. It was neat, utilitarian, and spoke to purpose. But to Karen, it was an eyesore, an offense, something she couldn't leave untouched. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a bright yellow highlighter, uncapped it with a little click, and turned toward Marcus, who had just leaned back into his seat to rest. Before he could react, she leaned across the shared space and drew a slow, curved streak directly across the embroidered badge. There, she said lightly, not looking him in the eye. A little color never hurt anyone. Your uniform was getting so dreary. Her tone was innocent, sing-song, but her hand had been deliberate. The line ran crooked across the insignia, like graffiti over a title. Marcus sat up slowly, staring at the fresh mark on his chest, then at her. His jaw remained clenched, but his voice stayed quiet. That's not yours to touch. Karen blinked, all faux surprise. Oh, I didn't know this part was sacred. It just looked so temporary. She recapped the marker and dropped it back into her bag with a small smirk. A couple of rows ahead, someone let out a cough, pointedly not looking back. A passenger to their left side glanced down quickly, then back at her book. Everyone had seen it. No one said a word. The silence validated her. Karen leaned back with the satisfaction of someone who had just tagged a wall and walked away. Marcus pulled a napkin from the seat pocket and began blotting the stain slowly, knowing it wouldn't come out, knowing she knew it too. He didn't look at her again. Minutes passed. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane entered its overnight phase. A few passengers reclined their seats, eyelids heavy from wine and altitude. Marcus stood quietly and walked toward the lavatory, his steps slow, purposeful. As soon as he turned the corner and disappeared into the aisle, Karen sprang into action again. She pressed the service button once, twice, then raised her hand toward a passing attendant, this time a young woman named Naomi, whose crisp uniform still bore the stiffness of someone early in her career. Naomi approached with a pleasant expression. Yes, ma'am. Karen leaned in and lowered her voice, but not enough that the nearby Rose couldn't hear. I'm sorry to bother you, she said, glancing toward Marcus's empty seat, but I think something spilled near my area. It smells chemical, like industrial cleaner. Naomi's eyes followed hers. Cleaner. Yes, Karen nodded, whispering louder now. I know it's probably nothing, but ever since he sat down, it's been unpleasant. I think it's coming from his clothes. Maybe from something he was using. She reached up and tugged lightly at the collar of her blouse, pretending to gag faintly. I just want to make sure it's safe. The fumes are a bit much. Naomi, clearly uncomfortable, glanced down toward the tray table, the seat, the carpet, none of which showed any visible signs of mess or spill. I didn't notice anything, she said cautiously. Karen shrugged. You know these people handle all sorts of cleaning agents. If it's soaked into his uniform, well, I just think a health check would be wise. A man across the aisle coughed again, this time glancing over with faint concern. Karen smiled sweetly at Naomi. I'm only thinking of everyone's safety. Naomi nodded slowly, still uncertain, but said she would notify the purser. As she turned away, Karen reached into her tote and retrieved a small travel-sized perfume vial. She sprayed a quick mist around her neck, then over the seat, then toward Marcus's empty space. Her fingers fanned the air theatrically. A woman 2 seats behind sniffed and whispered to her companion, who responded with a subtle eye roll. Karen didn't care. She had completed the performance. When Marcus returned and sat down again, the scent of floral perfume met him immediately, sharp, artificial, cloying. He noticed Naomi glancing his way and knew something had been said. He looked over at Karen, who met his gaze with wide-eyed innocence, and then looked away, humming softly to herself like someone completely unbothered. Karen had grown complacent. With each gesture of dominance, each act of disrespect met by Marcus's silence, she believed she had cemented her authority over the space they unwillingly shared. To her, his passivity was weakness, his calm a lack of power. So when a lead flight attendant, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and the quiet command of a seasoned professional, began moving through the cabin with a tray of neatly wrapped velvet boxes, Karen didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't until the woman reached row 2 and offered one of the boxes to Marcus that Karen leaned forward with renewed interest. "Oh," she drawled, "they give those to everyone now." The attendant smiled professionally. "Just for our most loyal elite members and contributors." She turned to hand Marcus the velvet box, but he shook his head gently, his tone as even as ever. "No need. I designed them." The attendant paused, then chuckled lightly. "Of course. I should have remembered. We made sure to include your name inside this edition." Karen blinked. Her eyes flicked to the box in the attendant's hands, then to Marcus. "You what?" she asked, voice coated in disbelief. Marcus didn't reply. He simply sat with his fingers steepled, eyes forward, the faintest shadow of a smirk pulling at one corner of his mouth. Karen forced a laugh, trying to recover. "I suppose you mean the cleaning supply kits? They do look quite polished." The attendant tilted her head, her smile patient but pointed. "No, ma'am. This is the executive designer's edition of our Platinum Legacy box. Mr. Hill was one of the original visionaries for our luxury guest program. Each gift is engraved inside with his initials, MH, in 24-karat foil." She turned and moved to the next row, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the bomb she just dropped. Karen's laugh dried on her lips. Her fingers clutched the blanket over her lap like it might protect her from what she had just heard. She turned toward Marcus, face shifting between confusion and denial. "She must be mistaken," she whispered, almost to herself. But Marcus didn't look at her. He remained still, composed, as if time had been waiting for this moment to catch up. 10 minutes later, the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit with a small bundle of envelopes. He made his way down the aisle, speaking softly to passengers in first class. "We're delivering invitations to next month's Legacy Board event. Attendance is limited to our top stakeholders and executives." Karen craned her neck, trying to glimpse the embossed logos on the envelopes as the co-pilot approached. When he reached Marcus, he offered a respectful nod. "Good evening, sir. I was asked to hand-deliver yours." Marcus took the envelope, slipped it into his jacket pocket without ceremony, and reached slowly into the inner lining of his uniform. Karen watched, puzzled, as his hand emerged holding a thin silver badge clipped to a retractable reel. He held it in his palm, then, quietly, deliberately, flipped it over. The letters gleamed under the overhead light. Marcus Hill, Chief Executive Officer, Legacy Airlines. The word founder was engraved in smaller type beneath. The silence in the row shattered like glass. A woman in 3C gasped audibly. A man near the front turned fully in his seat to stare. The co-pilot blinked, caught himself, and gave a quiet, "Thank you again for flying with us, sir." Karen's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Her skin, once flushed with smug superiority, had gone pale. Her fingers twitched against the armrest she had earlier claimed with so much self-righteousness. Marcus finally turned to her. No anger, no smile, just clarity. "You were right," he said quietly. "I don't belong in this seat. I designed it." Karen's eyes darted between the badge and his face, disbelief trying to reconstruct a reality where she hadn't just spent the last 4 hours attempting to humiliate the man who owned the very airline she trusted to uphold her comfort. You wore that on purpose," she stammered. Marcus nodded once. "I did." "Why?" she asked, voice brittle. The story now spoke for itself. The cabin crew, previously unsure of how to navigate the conflict, suddenly moved with clarity. Power had changed hands, not through noise or aggression, but through revelation. The lead flight attendant, the same woman who had distributed the velvet boxes, returned to row 2. Her expression was professional but firm, the kind of quiet authority that left no room for rebuttal. She stopped beside Karen's seat and leaned down slightly, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "Ma'am," she said, "we've received multiple in-flight reports about your conduct. I need to inform you that your behavior may be in violation of our airline's passenger conduct policy, specifically regarding harassment and discriminatory actions." Karen's lips parted, but no words came out. The attendant continued, "We will be documenting all incidents for review, including the physical defacement of another guest's uniform and reports of inappropriate comments regarding occupational status." Her tone was precise, clinical, not accusatory, just inevitable. Karen blinked. Her eyes darted around the cabin, hoping for an ally, a sympathetic glance, a distraction. But the people she once silently recruited with whispers and body language now avoided her gaze entirely. The couple across the aisle stared at the floor. The businessman who had once chuckled at Marcus's presence now fidgeted with his cufflinks. No one came to her defense. The lead attendant stood straight again. "Upon landing, you'll be met by a representative from our corporate ethics division. They will escort you to a private lounge for further discussion. Please remain seated until that time." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Karen frozen in place. Marcus remained still, his badge now tucked away once more, his body relaxed, his presence undeniable. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded justice. He had simply allowed the truth to be seen, and it had done all the work. 20 minutes later, as the plane made its descent and the fastened seatbelt sign illuminated, tension crackled in the air like static. Passengers straightened their backs, adjusted their belongings, and watched Karen out of the corners of their eyes. Her chest rose and fell in short, anxious breaths. Her face had drained of color. For the first time, she looked like someone completely aware of the consequences, but entirely unprepared for them. The wheels touched down with a bump. The cabin jerked slightly, and the familiar voice of the captain welcomed passengers to their destination. Polite applause followed, but it was hollow, nervous. Karen didn't move. As the plane taxied to the gate, 2 airline officials appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, one in a Navy corporate suit with a silver lapel pin, the other in a gray uniform bearing the insignia of internal compliance. Their presence was calm, but their appearance said everything. When the doors opened and the seatbelt sign chimed off, one of the officials stepped forward and addressed Karen directly. "Mrs. Middleton," he said, using her name from the manifest. "We'd like to speak with you in private before you exit the terminal. Please bring your personal items and follow us." She hesitated. Her hand hovered over her bag. "Why?" she asked, voice breaking slightly. "This is about ensuring our airline's values are upheld consistently," the man said, his voice polite but absolute. "We've reviewed preliminary feedback from the crew and passengers. We need to understand your side of the events." Karen turned to Marcus, as if searching for some gesture of mercy, a sign that this could still be undone. But Marcus didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the front of the plane, waiting. Another official stepped aside to make space. "This way, ma'am." The walk through the jet bridge felt colder than it should have, the sterile overhead lights illuminating every detail Karen wished would disappear. Her heels clicked unevenly against the floor, and with every step, the weight of the stairs from the crew behind her seemed to gather, not in sound, but in silence. 2 uniformed representatives from the airline's compliance division walked ahead, not speaking, not glancing back. She clutched her designer handbag against her chest like a child holding a safety blanket, her body slightly hunched. The gate door closed behind them with a hydraulic hiss, and the hum of the terminal beyond felt too loud, too public. Waiting at the end of the short corridor was another figure, tall, clean-cut, in a dark blue uniform trimmed with silver. His badge read Corporate Security Oversight. Behind him, just far enough to remain neutral, stood two airport police officers, calm, upright, no weapons drawn, no hands on holsters, just presence. Authority by proximity. Karen slowed her pace. "This is ridiculous," she murmured, mostly to herself. "I haven't done anything illegal." The man with the corporate badge didn't respond. He held up a tablet, swiped a few times, and then turned the screen toward her. There, frozen in time, was a still frame from the in-flight security footage. Her hand mid-stroke with the yellow highlighter, marking Marcus's uniform. Another swipe, her face slightly sneering, dropping his dusting tool between the seats. Another, her whisper to Naomi, index finger gesturing toward Marcus's chest, expression full of rehearsed concern. And finally, the moment she doused his notebook in juice, her hand caught in the act. She inhaled sharply. "You can't use these against me. I didn't even know there were cameras on board." "That," the man replied, his tone firm but void of emotion, "is clearly stated in the terms of carriage. For security and legal documentation, all premium cabins are under passive surveillance. And based on the visual records, as well as crew and passenger statements, we've completed a preliminary assessment." He reached into his coat and withdrew a document folder, crisp and labeled in bold font. "Immediate action, elite, conduct breach." He opened it, flipped to a page marked in red, and began to read. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Karen Middleton is hereby stripped of titanium elite status under Legacy Airlines frequent flyer program. Her access to all domestic and international lounges is revoked. She is also banned indefinitely from boarding any flight operated by Legacy or its global partners, subject to future review based on legal proceedings." Karen's lips parted, but the words caught in her throat. The security officer continued without pause. "All privileges accumulated through the reward system, including mileage accounts, companion upgrades, and concierge access, are nullified. Your status has been reclassified to blacklisted." "Blacklisted?" she repeated, voice small. "Like a criminal?" The man didn't answer. He simply turned and nodded toward the airport officers. One of them stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his voice quiet but firm. "You are not under arrest at this time, ma'am. However, we do need to inform you that a formal review has been initiated regarding potential violations of Title II of the Civil Rights Act, as well as possible occupational discrimination under public accommodation statutes." "I didn't threaten him," she blurted. "I didn't even raise my voice." "The law," the officer replied calmly, "recognizes behavior, not just volume." He paused, then added, "You may remain silent. You may also consult legal representation. But understand this, more than a dozen passengers witnessed your conduct. The footage has already been flagged and forwarded to both legal and media liaison teams. Public scrutiny is likely." Karen turned red, then pale. She looked around the quiet terminal as if expecting anyone, to intervene. But no one did. Behind her, another gate door opened, and passengers began trickling out from a different flight. Families laughing, friends chatting, people oblivious to the humiliation now unfolding just feet away. One of the officers held out a clipboard. "Please sign here to confirm acknowledgement of your removal and notice of conduct violation." Karen's hand shook as she took the pen. Her signature came out jagged and slow, the way shame often writes. As soon as she finished, the corporate officer gave a short nod. "You may leave the terminal. Your transportation has been arranged at your own expense. If you attempt to rebook with any of our partners, the flag will trigger immediate denial." "But I didn't," she started, but no one was listening anymore. The terminal doors slid open with a low mechanical hiss, letting in a gust of cool morning air that swept across Marcus Hill's face as he stepped outside. He walked with measured calm, shoulders relaxed, eyes straight ahead, the same Navy janitor uniform still draped across his frame, now wrinkled from hours in flight but unblemished in dignity. He carried no briefcase, no entourage, no luxury accessory to mark his status, yet the space around him adjusted with quiet reverence as soon as he appeared. Ground staff near the arrival's exit paused mid-task, a few whispering his name in disbelief, while others simply nodded in respect. Word had spread. Fast. Behind him, whispers among disembarking passengers rippled like wind through dry grass. Some hung back deliberately, watching him go, recognizing him now not just as a fellow traveler, but as a man who had changed the air at 30,000 feet without ever raising his voice. The black town car at the curb gleamed under the morning sun, not ostentatious, but impossibly clean, marked only by the subtle initials L.A., stitched in gold on the headrest covers. The driver stepped out quickly and opened the door. "Mr. Hill," he said with a nod, "welcome home." Marcus paused for just a second, turned his head slightly, and caught the gaze of a young man nearby, a baggage handler with tired eyes and calloused hands who had clearly overheard what had happened on the flight. Their eyes met. The handler gave him the smallest of nods, not out of recognition, but solidarity. Marcus returned it without a word and stepped into the car. The door closed with a quiet click, shutting out the noise, the heat, and the memory of everything Karen Middleton had tried to make him feel small for. But the story wasn't over. 24 hours later, Marcus stood beneath a bank of softly glowing lights inside a modest media hall at Legacy's corporate headquarters. The press conference had been hastily arranged, but the room was already packed. Reporters, crew members, stakeholders, some in suits, others in high-visibility vests and facility polos identical to the one Marcus had worn. Cameras flashed. Microphones clicked on. A silence spread through the room as he approached the podium, dressed again in his janitor uniform by choice. No suit, no tie, just the truth. He placed a small card on the stand, though he never looked down at it once. His voice was calm, clear, and unwavering. "I was raised by a woman who cleaned other people's floors for 30 years, he began. "And she never once asked for thanks, just respect." He let the words settle before continuing. "Yesterday, I boarded one of our flights in the uniform that built this company's foundation. Not to test anyone, not to trick them, but to remind myself and everyone watching what this space is supposed to stand for." The cameras zoomed in. A few reporters leaned forward. Marcus continued, "We say first class represents excellence, but it cannot mean exclusion. We promise luxury, not superiority. Comfort, not cruelty. I wore this uniform because I wanted to see how people treat the ones they think can't speak back. I wanted to know whether we've built a culture of welcome or a curtain of performance." He paused, scanning the room. "Yesterday, someone tried to humiliate me because of what I wore. But what they didn't understand is this badge," he tapped the stitched label over his chest, "isn't a symbol of lower status. It's a symbol of responsibility. And for too long, we've let uniforms divide people into roles instead of values." A murmur of agreement stirred in the crowd. Even some executives at the back had risen from their chairs, moved not by position, but by truth. "We're not canceling people," Marcus added. "We're correcting systems. And as of this moment, we're revising our internal training, our hiring protocols, and our elite conduct review policies, not just to protect our passengers, but to protect the dignity of every employee who makes this airline run." He stepped back from the microphone. Applause broke, not polite, not procedural, but real, lasting. When the room calmed, a reporter near the front raised her hand. "Mr. Hill," she asked, "do you regret not revealing who you were sooner?" Marcus smiled gently. "No," he said, "because some lessons have to be taught the hard way. And sometimes the floor isn't what needs cleaning." Then he stepped off the stage, through the crowd, through the line of flashing cameras, and into a hallway where the CEO badge still hung inside his jacket. But he didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Today, the name Marcus Hill spoke louder than any title ever could. The end. If this story struck a chord with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. It's how we keep bringing more stories that challenge, reveal, and inspire. What part of Marcus's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silence he kept, the moment of truth, or the justice that finally landed? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know how far this message is reaching. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We're listening.